way of engaging our supporters just across the US and keeping a sense of community among us. So we are grateful for your participation. Tonight, we are going to talk about Orwell's essay on politics and the English language, which for a word nerd is really interesting and really excited to hear what Jay Nordlinger will have to say. We are, of course, honored to be joined once again by Jay Nordlinger, our NRI book fellow and a senior editor of National Review. And before we get started, I want to make a couple of announcements. We have some events coming up this week. Tomorrow at 2:30 Eastern, we have an event on exploring conservative solutions to support families. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do so. Look for an email in your inbox. And then on Friday, for our 1955 Society members, we have a call at noon Eastern. And that's a conversation between Kevin Williamson and Jim Garrity on the Defund the Police movement. And this is taking off of Kevin's cover story from a few weeks back on Minnesota Nasty instead of Minnesota Nice. So you'll want to join us for that if you're a 1955 Society member. And then coming up this summer, back by popular demand, we have our Burke to Buckley summer session. We were so thrilled to have so many people join us last summer for Burke to Buckley in a Zoom format, and we'll be bringing that back to you again. So definitely think about that. Think about people in your life who might benefit from that education. And then if you've already taken the course, we have a 201 Burke to Buckley for those who have been through the first program. So stay tuned for more details on signing up for that. So just a little housekeeping note before we get started. You want to change your Zoom setup to speaker view to give whomever speaking your full attention. And then if looks like we have a smaller group, so we might have a more free-flowing discussion here tonight. But if you do want to ask or respond to a question, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen and unmute yourself when you're called on, and we will go from there. So take it away, Jay.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everybody. Nice to see you. That's a heck of an essay, isn't it? No wonder we're still reading it after all these years. It was published in 1946. It's not that often you read an essay so old, outside of Montaigne or someone like that. I've made some notes, some disparate notes. I'm not even sure they're in a proper order. I'll just share them with you for the purpose of stimulating a discussion. There's such a close connection between language and thought. I think that's in the wrong order, though, between thought and language, and between politics and language. I'll give you a little tidbit from my own life, my own career. Sometimes I have trouble writing, saying something, and if I analyze it, it's always because I don't know what to think, not because I don't know what to say. Once I know what to think, I can express it. So people who want my advice, young writers, I often say, before you sit down or put pen to paper, whatever we do now, do be clear in your mind what you want to say. Therefore, you will have the words. For example, you live at 123 Elm Street. So if someone asks you where you live, you say, I live at 123 Elm Street. But if you're not sure of an answer to a question or what you really think about something, you will cough on the words as I do. Orwell made me think of political slogans. I checked out a chicken in every pot. I associated that with Huey Long, but it turns out it was used by the Republicans in 1928, the year Herbert Hoover ran and won. And the full slogan they used that year, this was an ad in a New York newspaper, was a chicken for every pot and a car in every backyard to boot. Now, I think that's pretty specific, but what about Make America Great Again? I think that may be an effective slogan because it's gauzy. When was America great or less great than? You can sort of fill in the blank in your own mind. Political slogans are a book unto themselves. I've been writing lately just a little bit about classes. For a long time, politicians in America have talked about the middle class, the great middle class. And interestingly, pollsters find that most everyone considers himself a part of the middle class, you know? And recently, Senator Marco Rubio was talking about working class values. He was going to honor working class values. And I thought, what are they? He never said, who's in the working class? Who is a worker? Not everyone who works, of course. And I guess I learned from Bill Buckley more than from anybody to examine political language and language in general. Orwell made me think of a recording I had long ago of Winston Churchill. I had an LP with various, what did we call them? Tracks, cuts, I can't quite remember anymore, bands. But I remember his saying he was scoffing at modern language. And he said, people are now saying in short supply instead of scarce. And what came in not long after that was on a daily basis instead of daily, on a weekly basis instead of weekly. At many points reading this essay, I thought of Bill Buckley, who, he was a natural writer, and he didn't necessarily think this word is shorter, this word is longer. And someone said to him once, almost accusatorily, why did you say irenic when you could have said peaceful? Why did you choose that fancy word? And Bill said, well, let me see that. And he read the sentence he had written, and Bill said, oh, I must have desired the third syllable. Because you see, the music had to match, This he did automatically. And an example I often use, this example doesn't originate with me. I read in a book once many years ago, The Flexibility of Shakespeare, who could write fancy and write plain. He could write in a Latinate way, which Orwell doesn't like, or in a very blunt Saxon way. So check out this phrase from Macbeth. The multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. The multitudinous seas incarnadine. Well, you can hear the waves in those syllables, That's what he was doing. But he could be a lot more direct, as in to be or not to be, that is the question. So I think in many of these writing things, many of these word choice things, the answer is, it depends. When I was younger, I think like a lot of young people, I was a real prescriptivist when it came to language. There's a right way and a wrong way. And there were, correct users and barbarians. But I read the work of a scholar of English named David Crystal. And I'm really angry at him. I really fault him because he knocked the prescriptivism right out of me, And the reason he did is that he shows how today's heresy is tomorrow's convention. What's wrong and barbaric today is the convention tomorrow, and it changes all the time. So you can never really hold on. At the same time, I do regret some of our evolutions. I've written down a couple for you, just for you to consider. There used to be a genuine distinction between envy and jealousy. And I thought it was a very worthwhile distinction. To be envious was to want something that someone else had. That was covetousness. To be jealous was fear that someone would take from you what you have. I liked the distinction between healthy and healthful. I thought it was useful. Healthful means conducive to health or salutary. A healthful diet, healthy is a state of health. I still observe that, but young people look at me like I have three eyes. And also, you'd find, I guess all the people are gone now. When I was growing up, older people said, let alone. Left alone was different than let alone. Let me alone. Say you have two people in a room and one is harassing another. And the guy being harassed says, "Let me alone." The guy says, "Okay." And they stay in the room peacefully. "Leave me alone" used to be exit, and "leave me as the only person in this room." Just a little thing, but these things are gone. I also notice our grammar changing. The young people in my shop, I consider it barbaric, but almost all of them say, if I would have known it would be cold, I would have worn a scarf. If I would have known you were coming, I would have baked you a cake. This thing has grown up like a weed. And it seems that, people like me can't weed fast enough. I mentioned in my notes to you this problem of cliches. David Price Jones used to say, try to avoid grievous error, fatal flaw, errant pedantry. I was writing the other day and I wanted to write lavishly talented. And I emailed David and I said, "I know you wouldn't like it if I wrote lavishly talented. I should pick another adverb." And he was charming about it. But I think sometimes these cliches are okay because they enter the language almost as macros. I have a little note on pronunciation here. Pronunciation changes the way meanings change, the way even our syntax changes. Mark Helper and I used to laugh that we were the last of the Mohicans. It really is short-lived and long-lived. And everyone around me, certainly the young, says short-lived and long-lived, which is just wrong because you don't want the verb there. It's the noun, having a short life or a long life, long-lived, short-lived. But the problem with pronouncing things in the old ways is people look at you like you're nuts. So I sometimes vary my pronunciation based on the audience. You remember the expression, to err is human, and Alice Roosevelt Longworth had the witticism, to slur is Truman. But if you pronounce that word err instead of err, then her witticism makes no sense. Just one of my many examples. Have you noticed this new word, this new use of around? People's thoughts around COVID. A lot of people have concerns around China. Mona Charen first pointed this out to me, and I didn't know what she was talking about. But since she did, I hear it every single day. Wonder if you have. This is something new in our language, as in the last 5 or maybe 7 years. I'm one of the last people who say man and mankind to mean everybody. It never meant just the male sex, the rights of man. Never. And I must say that I resent the belief that it does. The phrase "to each his own" does not exclude women. It means everybody. And I guess I'll go to my grave not saying "to each their own." I just can't. I can't make my mouth do it. But I can tell you that all young people around me do. There's even this terrible word, this pronoun, themself, I've seen that now in print, not just said. Then there's a whole issue of sexual matters and language. I did a podcast with one of my favorite academics. She's also an activist. Her name is Donna Hughes, and she's devoted her life to investigating and opposing human trafficking. And she wrote a piece recently, very controversial, but part of it had to do with language. There's this phrase, people who menstruate. I noticed a headline from CBS News on a website over the weekend. New CDC guidance recommends pregnant people get the COVID-19, and just the word pregnant people, I realize I'm a fogey, but it seemed to me outright creepy. And language is very much connected with thought, right? What do you think? And I dislike the fuzzing up of things. And last, and I think I've had enough of a rambling introduction for everyone else to respond or to go in his own direction. The older I get, the more allergic I am to euphemisms. I'll give you when I was young, I very much disliked low-income people. Oh, you mean poor? It doesn't make them less poor to call them low income. Sightless people, you mean the blind? The hearing impaired, well, are they deaf? I don't really like the prettying up of these bad things with soft language. Of course, we could have a debate about that. And I guess my ultimate example is I've never really liked pro-life and pro-choice. I mean, obviously, most of us anti-abortionites would dislike pro-choice, but I'm not even sure about pro-life. I'm anti-abortion, and I call myself anti-abortion because personally, I think abortion's a good thing to be anti, and I think people should just say what they mean. You know, so I realize I've presented all this in a get off my lawn tone, but looking forward to hearing what you have to say about Orwell or anything I've said. The subject of language is a rich one. I've written about it my whole life, and I'm just drunk on words. And by the way, I met Bill Buckley because for the Weekly Standard, I wrote a review of his language collection called The Right Word. And that started off my relationship with Bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jay. It looks like we have Andrew Morgan up first with a raised hand. Andrew?
Hi, I'd be interested in Jay's or anyone else's thoughts or comments about, there's a quote that something Orwell wrote in the last chapter of the essay that we're looking at. He said, "The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there's a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish squirting out ink." And it sort of reminds me of, there's a critical race theorist named Alison Bailey. She was writing about the attempt to preserve one's privilege, and she uses this term, privilege preserving epistemic pushback. 4 words, 12 syllables, 1 hyphen. Does anybody have a comment on things like that?
Well, sometimes language is like fog, and we dance around with language when we don't want to say what we mean or don't know what we mean. I think of an example from the 2000 presidential campaign. There was a candidate's questionnaire, and one of the questions to George W. Bush and Al Gore was, what do you think about baseball? Artificial turf or natural turf, and Bush had owned, I think, or maybe did still, I don't know, a baseball team. And Gore had a very, very long answer when he talked about pros and cons and so on. I'm sure it wasn't stupid, but it was just long. And Bush said, "I think baseball ought to be played on grass." And someone pointed out, it might have been George Will, pointed out just the simplicity and directness of that. Sometimes the answer yes or no can be arresting if you can give such an answer. Now, sometimes you just can't because it's too pat. But a simple yes or a simple no, will you marry me? Well, on one hand, on the other hand, Harry Truman used to say that he wished for a one-handed economist who's always on one hand, on the other hand. Who else wants to chime in on this very thing?
Okay, let's go to Roy Miller. Got his hand up next. Roy?
Just a quick question, Jay, on your preference for anti-abortion versus pro-life. I'm wondering if the term pro-life might have the advantage of it allows for life to begin at some other point than conception, which for some of us is viability.
Yeah, I can see that. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, maybe I've gotten too crusty. My little beeper goes off when I hear a euphemism.
But I share your general concern.
Yeah. Let me tell you a story without too many details, but a woman, I think in a hospital or nursing home, she just wanted to check out. And someone came to visit her, full of hope. And the lady said to him, don't you think it's just time for me to pass on? And her friend said, you mean die? And she didn't like that at all. But I'm sorry to bring up so grave a subject, but it's an amusing story,
Well, I have to add to that, even animals today, we don't kill animals, we harvest them or we take them. We don't kill animals.
A friend of mine pointed out, in fact, it was Ignat Solzhenitsyn, the middle son of the writer, pointed out to me that creepy Soviet word liquidate, murder, liquidate. I don't know who invented that word or why, but it just means murder. Donna Hughes was telling me on our podcast that the trans movement, they refer to, I'm sorry to be gross, but they refer to top surgery and bottom surgery. And Donna says by top surgery, they mean a double radical mastectomy. Why not just use the words that people are familiar with and that mean something?
Okay, Kurt Witzel, looks like you're up next.
Hey, Jay, how you doing?
Hey, Kurt, hello.
Good to see you. Thanks for doing this for us. Appreciate it very much.
Oh.
Question, and I was listening, after I was done listening to Q&A, I listened to a different podcast this morning, and they were interviewing a freshman congressman from St. Louis, and she talked about environmental justice.
Oh, yeah.
And the word justice just sort of piqued my interest, because justice is like the new word, the new hot word that you can use with anything. It's social justice, it's environmental justice, and to your point earlier, instead of being anti-abortion, you could be life justice, and and advocate in that respect. So it was interesting to see that the progressives, she's a very left-wing progressive, the progressives are using the word justice to make everything good. How can you be against justice? Which was interesting. And the other thing that's recently came out is the difference or the change in what used to be equality. We're looking for equality, which basically says that everybody has the opportunity to achieve something down the road if they work for it. That word equality is changed to equity, and which is an ending word, which means that everybody should end up with the same thing. And I think they're blurring those two words together on purpose without anybody sort of paying attention to say, yeah, we don't really want to have to work for it. We just want to come up with the same ending. And we all want to be, and it's equity, it's not equality. But the words are so similar that they're using them as the same word and confusing the end product of that. Thoughts?
Well, Kurt, I'll say something probably too simple. Equality of opportunity versus equality of results. You may allow me to enter the race, the track event, but I ain't going to win the race. I guarantee you. But so there won't be an equality of result. The fastest person will win. But if anyone can enter, if it's a free for all, or if anyone has a chance to post a time to qualify for this particular race, it's equality of opportunity. Absolutely. Very, very important distinction. There's that funny language in our charter. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I don't think the religion is explicit there, but I do believe it's implied, equal in the eyes of God. This doesn't do anything for my foot speed.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kurt. And let's go to Shelley Garrett. Shelley?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Hi again, Jay. Thanks for
Hey,
running
Shelley.
this series
Hey.
on Orwell. Just to follow up on the line that was quoted first, the greatest enemy of clear language is insincerity. I think you'd also have to add in ignorance. Either you don't know it or you do and you want to hide it. And we have too many examples of both in what we hear. I know that when I have to write, and I'm gonna ask if you do too, Jay. When I write about things, the first thing I do is just write out longhand, and then I go back in, cut sentences in half, remove words. I do a brutal editing so I can get down to something that my reader can read. The other thing, by the way, is acronyms. You get the nifty 4-letter acronym that applies to sub-Saharan tent making that might also apply to philosophy. And in that way, I think that's a way to exclude people instead of bring them in. So there's a lot of language problems we have, which lack of clarity hides many sins. And anyway, I wonder what people think of that.
Well, you remind me of the old line, if I had more time, if I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. It's sometimes attributed to Alexander Pope. When you really know what you want to say, you can say it pretty succinctly, pretty tersely. Otherwise, you emit a fog of words. It's one way of buying yourself time. And I remember there's a lawyer I knew many, many years ago, and I so enjoyed something he did. He'd ask a question of one of his associates, and the associate would hem and haw, and he'd start to and emit these words. And this fellow, Mark, would say, if you don't know, it's okay. It's okay if you don't know. You say you don't know. He'd say, there are a million things I don't know. You say you don't know. And often the younger person would gulp and say, I don't know. Mark would say, great. Now let's find out. But people are often afraid of it, especially the intellectually insecure are afraid to say, I don't know. Buckley said, I don't know all the time when he didn't know. He was so completely secure, So no, I know exactly what you mean. And I do think that writers, at least most of them, now some writers and medical journals and so on, write for specialists, other specialists. Right. But if you're writing for a general audience, I mean, I started to write, I remember the first or second piece I ever wrote, and I said, I had attended an event. Frankly, it was a Pavarotti so-called arena concert. And I would have written my great aunt about this anyway in a letter. We were writing letters in those days. So I essentially wrote my letter to my great aunt, whom I'd been writing my whole life, and then gussied it up just a little. And that was my print piece.
I know that one of the things I do read as a matter of interest is the proceedings from the Naval War College. And it's good. The problem is when they start going into acronyms about special programs, that what you really want to know is, what's the program for? How does it fit into the strategy? At least is my thing. And I think from the editor's standpoint too, because they're trying to convince people we need a strong Navy and we need these things to show. But if you call something a 5-letter acronym, you just lose people.
Just about the only military acronym I know is SNAFU.
And it is alive and well today, I can tell you. It was alive and well in the picture behind me.
What's Shelley, tell us about the scene behind you.
Okay, the scene is May 1864, outside of Massaponax Baptist Church. And the staff of the Army of the Potomac is sitting around on pews they pulled out. A picture is taken from the belfry. The gentleman you see leaning over my shoulder here is Ulysses Simpson Grant.
Oh
and
my.
he's leaning over the commander, George Meads. And I thought this is such a cool thing because there's a lot of stuff going on in it. US 1, where the church is right next to, was the main thoroughfare roadwise down to the south and down to flank Lee in the Overland Campaign. So
Great, great.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. Let's go to John Farabee. John?
Hello, everyone.
John?
Jay, I appreciate your comments at the beginning, talking about the connection between thought and language. And it does seem to me that it is incredibly tight. They really feed into each other. But one thing is definitely true, and that is, I learned years ago, I'm not a facile writer, but I appreciate good writing. I was struggling writing something once, and it finally dawned on me that I didn't know what I wanted to say. And it's such a simple thing, but it was a very powerful revelation, and it sent me off in a different trajectory regarding writing thereafter. But then I'll connect this with with Orwell's remark on the cuttlefish,
John,
which I thought to be
really.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, hold it. I just want to interject on that very point. Sometimes people say to someone like me, how long did it take you to write the piece? And it's difficult to know what the questioner means. Research it, think about it, the physical act of writing.
Yeah.
As you said about your own experience, that's the last thing you do.
Exactly.
And writers have different styles. I can tell you, Paul Johnson, for an essay or a chapter of a book, thinks about what he wants to say. Thinks, works it all out in his head. And when it's completely thought out and written in his head, he simply writes it down one draft so that others can read it. I'll give you the opposite type is William F. Buckley Jr. and me for that. Bill could not start to think until his fingers were touching a keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go you one further. Mozart composed music like Paul Johnson. The music was in his head from first note to last. He wrote it down only so you and I could see the score. It was perfect, and he never had any emendations, no crossing out, nothing. Beethoven, not a shabby composer, but had drafts, sketchbooks, and all that stuff. Just two different working styles. Keep going, please.
Wow. Well, sort of a related incident. I had a painter in my house recently. He was very thorough in prepping. And I asked him, what portion of the painting job is prep? He actually said like 75%. The painting is just the end. It's just the end. That's what we think of. You're painting your room. The job is painting. Well, that's a minor part of it. But then I'll go back to the cuttlefish. I thought that was a very powerful, a revealing metaphor that Orwell used. And it brings to mind the fact, and I do take this as a fact, that people have different motives when they communicate, and most definitely politicians do. It is not clarity of thought. It is to obfuscate, to mislead, to deceive often enough. And so their language comes out that way. And to your examples earlier, about misleading language. I think that's the reason, but the transgender language. It's to soften things, to make it more appealing or more encompassing. It's not for the purpose of clarity.
Of course, there are things that are technically true, but not really true. I'll give you an example. Governor Clinton, were you in the hotel alone with her? No, there were clerks and other guests and bellhops and janitors and waitresses. You know, this is from real life. He was very, very smart, that fellow.
Yeah.
No, wasn't alone in the hotel, but you have to ask a more precise question if you want a real answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
John. Let's go to Stephen Wallach. Stephen?
Jay, if you don't mind my possibly putting you on the spot, I wonder if you could name some names. Orwell begins with some examples of bad writing from a Professor Harold Lasky and a Professor Lancelot Hogben. Do you have some people today who you think are examples of folks who don't write honestly in the manner that Orwell would endorse, academics, pundits, what have you?
Not really, because I guess I avoid them. So I'm trying to think of deep.
Can I'd like to answer that question. This is Craig Kanaki.
Sure.
There is a whole book describing the obfuscated language that's employed by postmodernists. And I'm sorry, his name is. He recently passed away. He's a famous British conservative writer.
Roger Scruton.
Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton has a wonderful book on this. It includes quotes at great length about the incomprehensible prose of the people like Derrida and Foucault.
There was do you recall this famous hoax in the 1990s?
Yeah.
The Sokal hoax.
Alan Sokal, yeah. And at the Weekly Standard, we published a piece about that called My So-Called Life. And he wrote the silliest, most obscure thing he could, just to parody. And it was accepted by some academic journal, I think. Writers and talkers should really want to be understood, whether people agree with them or not. The reason you talk or write is to convey things. And if someone clouds it up, he may not want you to understand him. I read a piece, this is the name of, forgive me for not naming a name, but I read a piece not long ago, a couple of months ago, by a well-known writer about policy. And it sounded pretty good. And I started thinking about it sentence by sentence. And I didn't think the sentences made sense at all. And John Podhoretz taught me something when I was at the Weekly Standard. He was our deputy editor. He had a rule. He got a piece by a brilliant man, a truly brilliant man. This isn't the case of a charlatan, but an academic. And this happened in 2 instances. And he said, I'm so sorry, it's over, man. I just don't understand it. And John's rule that he taught me was never publish anything. This doesn't go merely for a piece, but for a sentence or a paragraph. Do not publish anything that you yourself don't understand. Don't count on your reader's understanding. If you don't understand it, don't publish it. So yeah, beware the fog makers.
Okay, Diana Pepitone, let's hear from you.
The question I had was wondering about was one that got touched on a little bit, but it seems when he starts out that he's talking about sort of laziness of mind. He in the beginning references his critiques of staleness of imagery and lack of precision, and spends a lot of time about using some language crutches. But it didn't seem like he spent much time on the type of critique that was brought up, I think, by John and one of the other speakers about postmodernist type language, language meant to deceive or to distract the reader because of some ulterior motive, which is intended to sway opinion while cloaking that intent. It seems he gets a little bit into it under the section which uses political writing is bad writing in the first sentence, but it didn't. I just was wondering if there was an opinion on, is that at all one of his goals in writing this? I mean, it's titled, politics in the English language, but it seems to get or spend much of its time on sort of the laziness of language, as opposed to this sort of bad intent language.
That's true. It's an interesting choice of title because the essay is broader than that. It's quite right. Yeah. Sometimes people like to speak in code. It makes them sound as if they're onto something, or they have a secret that you can't quite divine. Other people want to be as plain as possible. Orwell talked about in some other piece, he said that he wanted his writing to be like a window pane that was beautifully clean, that you could see right through. And also he wanted, and I want, frankly, a reader to be able to read fast without having to stumble, even without having to stop and consider much. I don't have to see my hand, I like a reader to go whoosh down the page, whoosh like this. Now, Mark Helpman's a very good writer, and he does not feel that way. He does not feel the need to enable his reader to read fast. He doesn't mind if they have to pause for a bit and puzzle over something. And of course, he's a marvelous writer. But I sort of like the kind of piece or book chapter that makes the reader say, oh, where'd that go? It just slipped by so fast. And also, sometimes as a writer, you want to draw attention to yourself. And I think this should be done personally very, very rarely. Otherwise, the writer, to my mind, should be almost invisible. But that's a choice. Diana, what was that Orwell line near the top that you quoted? Did you quote a line? Could you give it to me once more?
My printout doesn't have page numbers, so but he begins by highlighting 4 selections that he critiques.
Oh yes.
Four passages, and then after those passages, he says that each of these passages has faults of its own, but quite apart from avoidable ugliness, 2 qualities are common to all of them. The first is staleness of imagery, the other lack of precision.
Yes, well, indeed, I will tell you this, there are different strokes for different folks, and I will make a confession. I've many times, I wrote an essay about this once, tried to read Bleak House of Dickens. Ever since Harold Bloom wrote in his book, The Western Canon, that Bleak House and Middlemarch were the 2 greatest novels in the English language. I've given Bleak House my best shot. I just can't. I just can't read it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with Dickens. I think there's something wrong with me, but I just can't. And I finally waved the white flag, and I'm not going to try anymore. But I assume it's a work of genius. So the receptivity of the reader does have something to do with it. I have an intellectual friend who reads Derrida and Foucault with pleasure. I cannot. I don't know how. So, yes.
Thank you, Diana.
I have to confess, and this may be really heresy to some of you. Hold on to your socks, everybody. I like the idea of Faulkner better than I like Faulkner himself. I hate to tell you this, and I've given him my very best shot. Sound of Fury, The Mosquitoes, Absalom, Light in August. To me, it's work. To me, it's work. And some literary critics and others might say, yeah, go ahead and work. But I want to go fast. Sometimes I'm so much in the thrall of a book. Has this ever happened to you? That as I'm nearing the end, I slow down because I can't stand for it to end. I love that feeling.
What about The Bear? Did you ever read The Bear? Faulkner's The Bear?
Is that a short story? Or a novel?
Or novella, short story. It's also appears in The Big Woods with some other stories.
I read The Bear and I read Barn Burning. And to me, it was like eating vegetables, and I like hot fudge sundaes, but I know that Faulkner is hot fudge sundaes for millions and millions and millions of readers.
I asked, I'm sorry to intrude here, but I read The Bear, and I grew up on a farm, so a rural background, somewhat similar perhaps to Faulkner and the people he was writing about, a little bit perhaps. I found it the most moving thing I think I've ever read. It's difficult. The way he wrote was difficult, but I almost don't want to touch it now because it might be diminished if I go back to it. But I've read it a couple of times, and I'm almost afraid to go back. But I'm moved to do it in the fall when hunting season comes in.
Don't be afraid to go back, and I'll put The Bear near the top of my list. And I can tell you that Norm Podhoretz, who is now in his 90s, has read Anna Karenina about 12 times, and he says he's not through with it yet. He finds something different, something marvelous, something new every time he reads it. I'm still working on my first time, but I just love the idea of being so admiring of a book that you return to it. I've left too much unread to afford to read something for a second time, but I just love that about Norman.
I will just say this: if you read it, I actually don't think I've ever read The Bear. I've read it in The Big Woods, which is a collection of stories, and that omits the lengthy chapter. I think it's chapter 5 in The Bear, which is a novella, where the key characters go over a contract. And it's really a quite convoluted chapter, apparently. So if you read it in the Big Woods, it will omit that very difficult section, if that helps at all.
Good to know.
It's so good to hear someone else who's in that same category. My wife thinks that I'm absolutely crazy because when I get down to the last chapter, I'm a big mystery fiction book, Baldacci, Vince Flynn, Lee Child, and when I get down to the last chapter, I start doing it in pages, where I'll read 3 pages a night and then put it aside because I don't want it to end. And it's good to hear there are other people with that affliction.
Okay, Sam Lissman has been waiting patiently. Sam? what do
Thank
have?
you. Jay, my first thought was when reading the essay is that he's absolutely right overall, but certain things definitely came across as fuddy-duddy, or as you said, get off my lawn. Imagine where Tom Jones would be if he had taken Orwell's advice in getting rid of the not un.
Mhm.
He'd have no money because he wouldn't have known that it's not unusual. Um,
Yeah, I was thinking you can overdo these things, but not unimportant is a little different from important.
Yeah.
You know? But he cited some absurd examples. So
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
his rules, I think, he says, doesn't he? His rules are more like guidelines and generalities.
He says break them to avoid ugliness.
Yeah, yeah.
And he comments that he himself has violated some of them in this very essay.
Sure.
So it's more of an aspirational set of guidelines.
Don't use the passive voice until you should.
Yes.
And your language instincts will tell you when.
The other Faulkner I would recommend is actually The Reavers, which was his last novel and is his lightest and most comedic, according to the scholars. And I enjoyed it greatly, just to throw out there. Another thing that this brought me to, when we were just talking about being able to read quickly versus having to stop and think and whatever, when I first read Jim Garrity's Between Two Scorpions, which I enjoyed greatly, and I enjoyed Hunting Four Horsemen as well. When I was sort of doing a review in my mind in between chapters as I was doing other things, and it occurred to me that it was something like, this is not a Blackford Oaks novel. And not every National Review writer who tries to do a spy novel should have to be Buckley. And WFB, as you put in your notes, would not have done well under Orwell's rules here. I can't, I'm sure you know even more than I do, but I can't tell you the number of times I read him explaining, you use the right word in the situation. If there are 2 words that are perfect synonyms, sure, go with the shorter one. But rarely are 2 words perfect synonyms.
Depends on the rhythm of your sentence.
Yes.
And as I think Bill's editor, Sam Vaughn, once pointed out, that Bill in the same column would use the word wow and the word stochastic. But a conventional columnist, like he cited Joseph Kraft, who's once a very big deal, wouldn't use either word because one was too low and the other was too high. So Bill is known for using fancy words, and he himself sort of didn't mind this reputation. But more than that, he used the right word. And you recall that he wrote a column. He read a book by John Updike. I think it was a collection, and he noted all the words he didn't know. He wrote a column listing all these words, and the column was "Passing the Sesquipedalian Torch." And he said at the end, if you want to bother someone about long and and esoteric words. Bother Updike, not me. And I'll tell you something about Bill's choice of words. He could be fancy, he could be very plain. Once Rick Brookhiser told him something, people hadn't behaved very well. Rick had written, I could explain the circumstances, I think 3 handwritten letters, and didn't have responses, a response from anybody. And he laid out all this. This is when he retired from the New York Observer, when Rick did. And he related this to Bill. You know what Bill said? People can be so shitty. And there's also a story I prize about Kingsley Amis, the wittiest man, maybe in the English-speaking world. And he was at lunch, and a woman came up to him, Mr. Kingsley, Mr. Amis, I've read your latest book. Yes. I must say, I just didn't think it was up to your usual standard. And Kingsley Amis was the wittiest person alive. And according to David Price Jones, he got red in the face, his veins bulged. And he told the woman, not using these words, to buzz off. That was Kingsley Amis's very, very human response.
You use the words that are appropriate to the situation.
Yes.
And that is the issue with this essay, is that we write for multiple purposes. We write to express our thoughts. We write to give instruction. But as he talks about the Soviets and the euphemism that they use for the forcing people off of their farms, the relocation, or I've lost the exact spot of it. Sometimes we write to justify what we're doing or to paint it better. It's public relations and nothing more.
We soften the blow. You know, I'm forgetting the Soviet Union, I'm thinking of daily life. You know, I was let go.
Yeah.
Instead
of I was fired.
Can I tell you one reason I admired Al Haig? I heard him once say on television, the president fired me. No one talks like that. You know, I submitted my resignation. I really admired that. And remember when it got out that in some sort of talks having to do with the Falkland Islands, he had called James Callaghan, the British foreign minister, a duplicitous bastard. And Haig was confronted with this. He said, because he had a reputation of having garbled speech, he said, I couldn't have said it. It's much too clear.
Okay.
Very good.
Let's go back to Kurt Witzel. Kurt, what do you have for us? Your hand is up? No? Okay. How about John? Kirby, did you have another comment or question?
No, I hadn't raised my hand, but I guess one thing that was missing from the essay, or at least that you can see today that's not mentioned in the essay, and that is how word meanings are changing purposefully, at least at the hands of politicians. And then 2 examples that come readily to mind, of course, are infrastructure and bipartisan. And sort of on a related point, I could add the observations I've just read about this, one of which was in National Review. I think it was that Politico has told its reporters to not refer to the situation at the Mexican border as being a crisis any longer. And Biden has instructed immigration-related officials to not use illegal alien in their discourse. So,
yeah.
You know, conscious manipulation of the use of language, again, for purposes of obfuscation or inclusion or misdirection.
May I call on some people? Just it's
Sure.
not obligatory.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. Alan Rubenstein, do you have something you want to share with us?
A few things I was listening to as far as the totalitarian governments choosing to use obscure and obfuscation. I can't pronounce that word. Yes, that type of language is the Third Reich euphemisms for resettlement in the East and so on. And I was reading some documents my parents went through that special treatment. My parents came from Poland, and in reading the documents, they listed which transports the people were on and what the disposition was for. It was all filled in there, but there had to be a 350-page book published by the Research Center giving you direct explanations of what those words usually meant, because they were used in a creative way. So that's the evilness of this type of language. And I embrace it though sometimes. Instead of calling somebody homeless, I mock the PC culture by calling it residentially challenged and things of that nature. That's the intent to just totally spit at it.
Someone once referred to bald people like me as follically challenged.
Or non-hirsute.
Right. Meredith Giddings, may I call on you? Do you have something you wish to share?
Hi, Jay. How are you?
Good.
No, I was just thinking of a bunch of things as you all were talking, and one is there's a writer named Brian Gardner. He's a writer who writes legal books on legal writing, and it's very obvious when you read legal documents how many extraneous words are in there and unnecessary words when you can really get to the point. And it's almost a form of brainwashing in law school that they put you through. And then to get out of that takes a lot of extra work. But he says it really is okay just to put the plain old English language down in a legal document. In fact, it's more beneficial to everybody involved. But also I was thinking of a conversation I had with someone recently over dinner who sits on the opposite side of me politically. And they would probably call themselves progressive, which is also a word that Orwell used in his essay. And I can't really call progressives. I actually am in the habit now of calling them regressives, but that's just me. Because they're not, in my opinion, I don't see us progressing when we're talking about the things that they want to do to our country. But anyway, the discussion I had with my friend, he brought up the word privilege. And he was saying, you know, we're all really privileged in our own ways. And he said, don't you agree with that? And I said, sure, I just don't like the way it's being used in the, I can't use the word now because it's been the way it's being used. And he said, oh, you mean the way it's been weaponized? And I said, yeah, it's been weaponized, and certainly. And he said, well, whites aren't the only ones who are privileged. There are Black people who are privileged, who are Black and Asian and Latino. And I said, sure, but when was the last time you read an article that talked about Latino privilege? You just don't hear about this. And so I have a hard time now saying words that used to be a part of my vocabulary for whatever reason, because I feel like they're being forced out of me and warped in certain ways. So
Just what you mean. Just what you mean. Well, guys, it's now 7 o'clock, so drop off if you want, but I'm going to continue to call on people for some final remarks if you don't mind, but feel free to drop off. Randall Teague, something you want
to? Let me unmute. I have enjoyed this conversation a great deal, as I have enjoyed the two previous sessions also. I'm an attorney by practice, and it's amazing to get through an hour's discussion about the uses of language without Antonin Scalia being brought forward with these elaborated discussions of the changes in meanings from the Constitution's era to our era today. I, in this evening's session, was reminded Richard Weaver's, of course, comment was ideas have consequences, but ideas are combinations of words. And so it really does relate to the discussion tonight. And, you think of the differences you mentioned, Jay, at the beginning of this evening's session of even changing pronunciations. And the two that immediately came to my mind was the dramatic difference between recreation and recreation, and the dramatic, phenomenally great theological, perhaps, difference between holy day and holiday. And so, you know, as the language has transformed over time, we see these changes in meanings. Back in 1992, which was a long time ago, I was a visiting fellow at that time, the 5th largest foundation in the world, for about 90 days, because our law firm has a mandatory sabbatical of taking off 3 months every 5 years. You have to plan about a year ahead to be able to do that. And during that 3-month period, American politics was radically transformed, I think, because you know, we had talked about the Black vote in America being basically 10 or 11%, or at least that was the population. And the brown number was slightly less than that, the Asian number less than that. But in 90 days' time, the left in the United States, the academic left, the intellectual left, the nonprofit left, chose the phrase persons of color. And persons of color moved the numbers from 10 or 11% of persons that were competing with each other, because the blacks and browns have been competing with each other for 50 years for jobs. It put them all under one umbrella and created a political force of persons of color that in 1992 was probably 42, 44%, is now 49, and by 2025 it'll be 51. And so the political consequences of being able to come up with phrases consisting of words in a way that changes the political dimension in this country have been dramatic. And I think the left has been better at this than the right has been. I think they work very hard at it. My last comment, and I realize we're over 7 o'clock, and I apologize for taking this much time. George Will and I were sitting next to each other at a dinner function here in Washington about 3 or 4 years ago. And George said to me, he said, "Randy, when did we first meet?" And I said, when you were a legislative assistant to Gordon Allott of Colorado. And I think he was terrified that I would bring up such a low position in life around a table in Washington as to his origins and the use of the English language. Mm-hmm. And he paused for a moment and he shot back at me, "I was legislative director." And, you know, when you think of the ways in which persons that have columns that are designed to make, as you say, flow very rapidly, if there's anyone that writes intentionally to make you pause once or twice with each paragraph, is George. So I will end my comments at that.
He's about the gold standard. Blake Norris Batten.
Yes, sir.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Well, I don't know how that Blake got in there. That Blake is my government name. You've got to use your first name, which is an interesting language issue in and of itself. You can't use your middle name if you're going to do a government publication. You've got to use the full name, or Blake N. Anyway, what's on my mind is a couple of things. First, one of the things I enjoyed most in my late business career were the brief courses I had in plain language, which comes through a lot in the Orwell piece. I did investor relations in the last part of my career, and I had to work with attorneys who were obfuscators, as I had been trying to apply my training in plain language, and it was often a bloody battle. So, but I appreciate the plain language thing. And Jay, if you don't mind, this may be a little off color. What do you think of the practice that's emerging now of people using their pronouns to sign off on their publications?
They have funny pronouns and
no, I'm surprised. You will see people sign off an article with the pronouns that they use to apply to themselves.
Here's what I wonder, and this is not an answerable question, and I don't know that we'll be around to find out. But I wonder, generations from, will this thing stick, this pronouns thing? Will it be like this from now on? Or will people look back on it as some sort of craze or fad, like the pet rock or the lava lamp or the hula hoop or swallowing goldfish?
I certainly hope so.
I'd really like to know. I have a feeling this is a sort of period of silliness that is just going to fade out. I'd love to fast forward 100 to 200 years and see. Denisa Dushatkova Feddersen.
Hi.
Talk about full names.
Yes. I just wanted to comment, somebody mentioned the play on words with homeless. In California, we call them unhoused residents. And that sort of makes no sense to me either, because how can they be residents? But anyway, and as you know, I'm an ESL student. I wasn't born in this country. So for me, the change of language and the meaning is very difficult, because now that I almost mastered English, then the meaning changes. So anyway, I so appreciate the discussion. It's very educational.
Someone want to give us a benediction, a final word, a farewell?
I have one more question, Jay, if you'll permit me.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll go back to what Randy said earlier. And it's frustrating for me when I hear the progressive left utilizing words as a weapon, and somebody said it earlier, and they seem to be experts at it. And I think that we are less than expert at it. They use it as an offensive tool, and I feel like we're constantly on the defensive when it comes to that. And it's so easy for them to use words that, and as I said before, a difference between equity and equality, and try to convince people without really going into detail that what they're saying is right. And it's just frustrating why we don't have, like, we're not able to do that. I constantly, I'm so tired of being on the defense on that respect.
I have a suggestion for an article that I think might be a suitable, humorous ending, and it's in the vein of the simplicity of language. And some of you may be familiar with it. It's called The Deuce, written by Charles Krauthammer. So, sometimes when confronted with these contentious others, one can appeal to the simplicity of language that's described in The Deuce.
Jay?
Thank you, Craig.
Jay?
Yes.
Talking about the silliness of the pronouns in the signature thing, I once attended a conference it was an academic conference, but they asked about pronouns. So I simply put Lord High Executioner. That's how you should address me. And
well,
no one addressed me.
Right.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you all for the most
Thank you. Excellent.
enjoyable series. Well, take care.
Have
Thank
a beautiful,
Thank you.
beautiful week. And God bless George Orwell. What a man. Thank you all.
Indeed.
Double plus good.
Bye.
Thank you, Jay.